The morning mist clung to the valley like a secret unwilling to be told, turning the Oregon hills into shapes that shifted and dissolved before you could name them. Rusty stood in his pen at Holloway Ranch, head slightly lowered, ears twitching toward sounds only he could hear. But it was his eyes that made strangers look away, clouded white, unseeing, the mark of a horse the world had decided was finished. Still keeping that useless animal? The voice belonged to Frank Mitchell, a neighboring rancher who stopped by most mornings to drink coffee and share opinions nobody asked for. He leaned against the fence rail, watching Rusty with the particular disdain people reserve for things they've decided have no value. Blind as a stone and twice as slow. Don't know why you don't just put him down. Jack Holloway, who owned the ranch and whose weathered face suggested he'd learned long ago to ignore most of what Mitchell said, poured coffee from a thermos without looking up. He's not hurting anyone. He's not helping anyone either. That's the definition of useless, Jack. Mitchell laughed, a sound like gravel sliding down a metal chute. Horse can't work, can't ride, can't even find his own water trough half the time. What's the point? The point, Jack thought but didn't say, was that some things mattered beyond their utility, that Rusty had been his father's horse, trained with patience and kindness back when the world moved slower and people measured an animal's worth by more than productivity. That putting him down would feel like erasing the last living connection to a man who taught Jack that gentleness was a form of strength. But Jack had learned that explaining such things to men like Mitchell was like trying to describe color to someone who'd only ever seen gray. "Gates loose on the east pen," Jack said instead, changing the subject with the practiced ease of someone who'd been avoiding conflict his entire life. Need to fix it before... He didn't finish the sentence, because in that moment, Rusty's head came up sharply, ears swiveling toward the mountains that rose behind the ranch like a wall between civilization and wilderness. The blind horse stood perfectly still, every muscle tense, nostrils flaring as he tested air currents for information his eyes couldn't provide. "What's gotten into him?" Mitchell asked. Jack didn't answer. He was watching Rusty with the focused attention of someone who'd spent enough time with animals to recognize when they knew something humans didn't. 3 miles up in those same mountains, 11-year-old Caleb Warner pulled his jacket tighter against the morning cold and tried to convince himself he wasn't lost. He'd come up here seeking solitude, escape from the noise of a house where his parents' fights had become background music, from classrooms where he never quite fit, from the particular loneliness of being surrounded by people who didn't understand you. The trail had been clear when he started, but fog had rolled in with startling speed, transforming familiar landscape into something alien and threatening. Trees emerged from white nothing, then disappeared again. The path that should have led back down to the valley had somehow vanished, leaving Caleb standing on ground that felt increasingly unstable beneath his feet. "Hello?" His voice sounded small and quickly swallowed by the dense air. "Is anyone there?" Silence answered. The kind of silence that amplifies fear rather than calms it. Caleb took a step forward, then another, his hands outstretched like a blind man navigating darkness. The comparison would have struck him as ironic if he'd been calm enough to recognize it. Instead, panic was beginning to claw at his chest, making his breathing shallow and his thoughts scattered. He didn't know, couldn't know, that he was walking toward a cliff edge hidden in the fog, a drop of 70 feet onto rocks that had killed more experienced hikers than an 11-year-old boy. Back at the ranch, Rusty made a decision. The gate's loose latch, which Jack had been meaning to fix for weeks, gave way under pressure the blind horse had never applied before. One moment, he was in his pen. The next, he was moving across the ranch yard with surprising speed and certainty, heading toward the mountains while Mitchell and Jack were distracted by their conversation. By the time Jack noticed, Rusty had already reached the trailhead. "Your horse is loose," Mitchell called, pointing. Jack turned and felt his stomach drop. Rusty was indeed loose, moving up the mountain trail with the determined gait of a horse who knew exactly where he was going, which was impossible. Blind horses didn't wander off with purpose. They stayed close to familiar ground, disoriented by the darkness that was their constant companion. "Rusty," Jack called, already moving toward his truck. "Come back." But the horse didn't stop, didn't even pause, just kept climbing, following something only he could sense, a sound perhaps, or a scent, or some instinct that operated beyond the range of human understanding. "Told you that horse was crazy," Mitchell said, but Jack was already in his truck, following the road that paralleled the trail, his mind racing through possibilities that all seemed equally unlikely and equally terrifying. What if Rusty fell? What if he wandered into the national forest and couldn't find his way back? What if the blindness that had made him useless in Mitchell's eyes now became the thing that killed him? The fog grew thicker as elevation increased, until Jack had to slow to a crawl, barely able to see the road ahead. Somewhere in that white darkness, a blind horse was climbing a mountain for reasons no one could fathom. And somewhere higher still, Caleb Warner took another step toward a precipice he couldn't see, his young mind convinced that forward was the only direction left, unaware that forward meant falling. The morning had started ordinary. It was becoming something else entirely, a convergence of need and rescue, of blindness and vision, of the useless revealing themselves as essential in ways that would challenge every assumption people had made about worth and value, and what it meant to truly see. Rusty moved steadily upward, his hooves finding purchase on rocky trail that would have challenged a sighted horse. But Rusty had walked these mountains before, back when his eyes still worked, back when Jack's father had ridden him through every season and weather, teaching the horse to trust his other senses, to read the world through sound and smell, and the particular vibrations that traveled through earth and stone. Those lessons, learned decades ago, were saving his life now, and possibly someone else's. The fog swallowed sound and sight equally, creating a world where blind and sighted were finally on equal footing, where the seeing were as lost as those who'd never had sight to lose. In that leveled landscape, Rusty moved with the confidence of someone who'd been preparing for this moment his entire life without knowing it. In his pen, he'd been useless. On this mountain, he was becoming something else entirely. Necessary. Essential. The answer to a prayer that hadn't yet been spoken but was about to become desperate. The fog was a living thing now, pressing against Caleb's skin with damp fingers that chilled him to the bone despite his jacket. He'd stopped moving forward, some instinct warning him that the ground felt wrong, that the sounds were strange, that the air held a quality of emptiness that suggested open space rather than solid earth. But he couldn't stay still forever. The cold was seeping deeper, and his parents wouldn't realize he was missing for hours yet. He'd told them he was going to his friend's house, a lie that had bought him freedom but now trapped him in consequences he hadn't anticipated. Help! The word tore from his throat, raw and desperate. Somebody help me! The fog absorbed his cry, muffling it, turning it into something that might have been imagination or wind, or the ghost of sound that vanished before anyone could respond. Caleb took a shaky breath and tried again. Please, I'm lost. Can anyone hear me? This time, something answered. Not words, just a sound that might have been hooves on stone, distant but growing closer. Caleb's heart hammered between hope and fear. Hope that rescue was coming. Fear that his mind was creating sounds from desperation and thin air. Then, emerging from the white, nothing like a ship materializing from mist, came Rusty. The horse appeared so suddenly that Caleb gasped and stumbled backward. He'd never seen a horse's eyes look like that, clouded completely, unseeing, the color of old milk. For a moment, boy and horse simply stared at each other, though only one of them could actually see. Rusty's ears swiveled, forward, fixing on Caleb's breathing, his heartbeat, the small sounds of frightened movement. The blind horse took 2 careful steps closer, his muzzle extended, testing air for information about this human child who smelled of fear and cold and the particular sweetness of youth. Are you lost too? Caleb whispered, his voice breaking. Can you help me? Rusty made a sound low in his throat, not quite a whinny, more like acknowledgement. Then he did something that would stay with Caleb for the rest of his life. The horse moved forward deliberately and pressed his nose against Caleb's chest, then gently, insistently, pushed the boy backward. Caleb resisted instinctively. Stop, I don't understand. But Rusty pushed again, harder this time, forcing Caleb to take 3 stumbling steps away from the direction he'd been walking. The boy's foot came down on loose gravel, and the ground beneath him shifted. He windmilled his arms, trying to catch balance, and a cascade of small stones broke free and tumbled into space. They fell for what seemed like an eternity. 1 second, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then, from far below, the sound of impact, rock hitting rock with the finality of something that had fallen much too far. Caleb's legs gave out. He sat down hard on solid ground, his breath coming in gasps that were half sobs, understanding flooding through him with sickening clarity. He'd been walking toward a cliff. Another few steps, and he would have gone over the edge, falling the same distance those stones had fallen, hitting the same rocks with the same deadly force. The blind horse had saved him. The blind horse who couldn't see the danger had somehow sensed it, had found Caleb in the fog and pushed him back from death with the same certainty that sighted people navigated around obstacles they could see clearly. "You saved me," Caleb whispered, reaching up with trembling hands to touch Rusty's face. "You can't even see, and you saved me." Rusty stood still under the boy's touch, accepting the gratitude with the quiet dignity of animals who perform miracles without understanding why humans find them remarkable. This was simply what needed doing. The boy had needed saving. Rusty had saved him. The math was simple even if the mechanism remained mysterious. But the danger wasn't over. The fog showed no signs of lifting, the temperature continued to drop, and Caleb had no idea which direction led toward safety. His brief moment of relief gave way to the renewed understanding that they were both lost on a mountain where fog and cliffs conspired to kill the unwary. "I don't know how to get down," Caleb said, the words tumbling out now that he had something, to talk to. "I thought I knew the trail, but everything looks the same, and I'm so cold, and my parents don't know where I am, and—" Rusty interrupted by lowering his head and nudging Caleb's shoulder, then taking a deliberate step down the trail. The horse paused and looked back, though, of course, he couldn't actually see Caleb. He could hear the boy's breathing, could sense his presence in the way blind creatures learn to sense the world. The message was clear: follow me. "You know the way?" Caleb asked, hope rekindling, despite the impossibility of what he was suggesting. "But you're blind. How can you know the way?" Rusty simply stood there, patient and waiting, as if the answer was too obvious to require explanation. Caleb made a decision that was equal parts desperation and trust. He stood on shaky legs, moved to Rusty's side, and grabbed a handful of the horse's mane. "Okay, I'll follow you, but please don't walk us off a cliff." Rusty began moving down the trail with careful, measured steps. Each hoof placement was deliberate, testing ground before committing weight, finding the path through memory and sense that had nothing to do with vision. This was his mountain. These were trails he'd walked hundreds of times with Jack's father, back when the old man would ride for hours just for the peace it brought, talking to his horse about troubles and joys that horses couldn't understand but could somehow make bearable just by listening. Those rides had mapped the mountain in Rusty's mind, not with pictures but with a three-dimensional understanding of space and distance, of which stones wobbled and which held firm, of where the trail narrowed and where it widened, of the particular scent of pine trees that marked the safe descent, and the smell of open air that warned of drop-offs. Caleb clung to Rusty's mane and let himself be guided through the fog that had become their shared blindness. Boy and horse moved together down the mountain, the seeing trusting the blind, the lost following the outcast, both of them learning that value had nothing to do with what others could see and everything to do with what you could give when giving mattered most. Behind them, the cliff edge disappeared into fog. Ahead, somewhere in the white distance, rescue waited, though neither boy nor horse knew that search teams were already forming, that Jack was racing up the mountain road, that Caleb's parents had discovered his absence and were calling everyone they knew in rising panic. All they knew was this, that the world had become small and dangerous, that trust was the only currency that mattered, and that sometimes the useless became essential when you stopped measuring worth by what could be seen and started measuring it by what could be done. Rusty walked steadily downward, carrying with him the weight of a boy's hope and the redemption of a horse everyone had written off as finished. The fog began, ever so slightly, to thin, not enough to see clearly, but enough to suggest that clarity might return. That darkness, whether literal or metaphorical, was not necessarily permanent. That sometimes salvation came on four legs, with eyes that couldn't see, but a heart that could find lost children in impossible weather and guide them home through sheer, stubborn refusal to accept that blindness meant useless, that age meant worthless, that being different meant being less. Step by careful step, they descended together toward the moment when the world would see what Caleb already knew, that the horse everyone called useless was the most valuable creature on the mountain that morning, and that seeing had never been about eyes. Jack had abandoned his truck at the point where the road became impassable and was climbing on foot, his heart hammering with fear that had nothing to do with physical exertion and everything to do with the blind horse somewhere ahead in weather that could kill. He'd called for backup, ranch hands, neighbors, anyone who could help search, but the fog made organized rescue nearly impossible. He was preparing to turn back, to admit defeat, and pray that Rusty's instincts would somehow guide him to safety when he heard it. A sound that stopped him cold. A boy's voice, young and frightened but alive, calling out from somewhere higher on the trail. "Hello? Is someone there? We're coming down. Please don't go." "We?" The boy had said, "we." Jack called back immediately. "Keep talking. I'll find you. Just keep making noise." "There's a horse with me." The voice was closer now, excited and disbelieving. "A blind horse. He saved me from a cliff, and he's bringing me down, but I don't know whose he is or where we are exactly, but—" Jack didn't hear the rest. He was running now, climbing toward that voice, and when the fog finally thinned enough to see, the sight before him was something he would carry for the rest of his days. Rusty emerged from the white like a ghost gaining substance, moving with the careful certainty of someone who'd completed a mission beyond human understanding, and clinging to the blind horse's mane, his face streaked with tears and dirt and relief, was a boy no more than 11 years old. "Rusty," Jack breathed, and the horse's ears swiveled toward him, recognizing the voice of the man who'd refused to put him down, despite everyone saying he should. Caleb looked up and saw an adult for the first time in hours that had felt like days. "Is this your horse?" "Sir, your horse saved my life. I was about to walk off a cliff, and he pushed me back, and then he led me down, and I would have died without him. I know I would have." The words tumbled out in a rush while Jack approached slowly, his hands shaking as he reached first for the boy to make sure he was real and uninjured, then for Rusty to confirm that his blind horse had somehow accomplished the impossible. "Are you hurt?" Jack asked Caleb. "Just cold and scared. But your horse? He found me. How did he find me? He can't even see." "No," Jack said quietly, his hand resting on Rusty's neck, feeling the exhausted trembling of muscles pushed beyond their normal limits. "But he could hear you, and smell you, and sense you in ways we don't fully understand." He looked at the blind horse who'd been called useless just hours. "Ego. He sees better than most sighted creatures. He just sees differently." The rescue team arrived shortly after, first responders and search coordinators and Caleb's parents, who descended on their son with the particular desperation of people who'd been facing the worst and found better instead. The paramedics checked Caleb thoroughly, while the story emerged in fragments and eventually became whole. The boy wandering off, getting lost in fog, the blind horse breaking free and climbing the mountain, the near miss with the cliff, the careful descent guided by an animal everyone had assumed was only a burden. "This horse should be commended," the search coordinator said, a gruff man named Robert who'd seen enough mountain rescues to recognize genuine heroism when he encountered it. "Hell, he should be given a medal. Do they make medals for horses?" "They should," Caleb's mother said, tears streaming down her face as she approached Rusty with the reverence people reserve for things that have given them back what they had thought was lost forever. "He gave us our son back. There's no repayment for that. Nothing that would be enough." Jack led Rusty slowly down the mountain toward the ranch, Caleb walking beside them, his small hand resting on the horse's shoulder like he couldn't bear to break contact with the creature who'd become his lifeline. The boy talked continuously about the fog, the fear, the moment of understanding when stones fell, and he realized how close he'd come to falling with them, the trust required to follow a blind horse through dangers he couldn't see. "People at school called him useless," Caleb said suddenly. "I heard my dad telling my mom about the blind horse at Holloway Ranch. Said it was sad Mr. Holloway kept him around when he couldn't do anything useful anymore." Jack felt something tighten in his chest, but said nothing. "But those people were wrong," Caleb continued, his voice fierce despite his exhaustion. "Rusty isn't useless. He's a hero. He saved me when nobody else could. When people with eyes couldn't find me and people with training couldn't reach me, Rusty did it just by being what he is." They reached the ranch to find a small crowd had gathered, neighbors who'd heard about the rescue, ranch hands who'd known Rusty for years, even Frank Mitchell, who stood apart from the others with an expression that suggested he was reassessing opinions he'd held for too long. Caleb's parents wanted to do something, pay Jack, reward Rusty somehow, express gratitude that felt too large for words or gestures. But Jack refused payment gently and firmly, explaining that Rusty hadn't performed a service. He'd acted from something deeper than training or expectation of reward. He did what needed doing, Jack said simply, same as he's always done. We just stopped seeing it because we measured his worth by the wrong things. The local newspaper ran the story the next day. Then the regional news picked it up. Within a week, Rusty's face was everywhere. Social media posts about the heroic blind horse, news segments about his rescue, human interest pieces that made people cry and share and comment about the beauty of animals who saw with their hearts instead of their eyes. Visitors started coming to Holloway Ranch. Some wanted photos with Rusty. Others brought donations or offers to sponsor his care. Children who'd read about him online asked their parents if they could meet the horse who'd saved a boy's life despite being blind. Jack let Caleb visit whenever he wanted, which turned out to be nearly every day. The boy and the horse formed a bond that transcended the rescue, became about something larger, about two beings who'd felt unseen and misunderstood, finding recognition in each other, about the quiet conversations Caleb had with Rusty while brushing his coat, speaking truths to the blind horse that he couldn't yet speak to sighted humans. "People don't see me either," Caleb told Rusty one afternoon, several weeks after the rescue. "They see a quiet kid who doesn't fit in. They think I'm weird because I'd rather be alone in the mountains than at parties or sports or whatever normal kids do. But you don't think I'm weird. You saved me anyway, even though we're both different, even though neither of us fits the way everyone thinks we should." Rusty stood still under the boy's gentle hands, accepting the truth being spoken, offering the judgment-free presence that animals provide to humans, struggling to find their place in a world that too often values conformity over authenticity. Frank Mitchell came by one evening, hat in hands, to speak with Jack. The conversation was short and weighted with the particular difficult of men apologizing for beliefs they had held too loudly and too long. "I was wrong about your horse," Mitchell said without preamble. "I called him useless. I suggested you put him down, and he saved that boy's life while I was drinking coffee and running my mouth about things I didn't understand." Jack accepted the apology with the grace of someone who had learned that being right mattered less than being kind. "Rusty doesn't hold grudges, neither do I. Still, I learned something about measuring worth, about assuming I know what value looks like." Mitchell paused at his truck door. "That horse taught me more in one morning than I'd learned in 50 years of ranching. That's got to count for something." "It counts for everything," Jack agreed. The seasons turned, winter came and went. Rusty remained at Holloway Ranch, no longer the subject of jokes or dismissive comments, but instead a quiet celebrity, the blind horse who'd proven that sight and vision were not the same thing, that usefulness and value operated by different metrics than the world usually employed. Caleb grew taller, more confident, less apologetic about his differences. When kids at school asked about his friendship with a blind horse, he spoke with the authority of someone who'd learned essential truths that couldn't be found in classrooms or textbooks. "Rusty sees more than most people," Caleb would say. "He sees what matters. He saw that I needed help when everyone else just saw fog. That's better than having eyes that only look at surfaces." On the anniversary of the rescue, Jack and Caleb stood at Rusty's fence in the late afternoon light that painted everything gold and amber. The blind horse grazed peacefully, his clouded eyes catching no reflection of the beauty surrounding him, but his presence creating beauty nonetheless, the kind that came from simply existing with quiet dignity, from being yourself without apology, from offering help when help was needed regardless of whether anyone would notice or reward the offering. "Do you think he knows," Caleb asked, "that he's a hero? That he changed how people see blind horses?" Jack considered the question seriously. "I don't think he cares about being a hero. He just did what his heart told him to do, found a lost child and brought him home. Everything else, the stories, the attention, the changed minds, that's what humans added to a simple act of kindness." "But it wasn't simple," Caleb protested. "He climbed a mountain in fog. He found me when trained rescuers couldn't. He knew about the cliff, even though he couldn't see it." "You're right. It wasn't simple." Jack rested his hand on the fence rail, watching Rusty with the same affection he'd felt for his father's horse all those years ago. "But I think to Rusty, It was. He heard someone who needed help. He went to help them. The fact that he was blind, that everyone called him useless, that conventional wisdom said he couldn't do what he did, none of that mattered to him. He just knew what needed doing, and he did it. That's what makes him a hero, Caleb said softly. Not that he saved me, that he didn't let anyone else's opinion of him stop him from doing what he knew was right. The sun continued its descent, and Rusty lifted his head briefly, ears swiveling toward the sound of their voices, acknowledging their presence before returning to his grazing. He was blind. He was old. By most measures, he was still useless. Couldn't work, couldn't ride, couldn't perform the tasks that earned horses their keep on working ranches. But he'd saved a boy's life when no one else could, had proven that usefulness was a narrow measure that missed essential truths, had taught an entire community that vision came in forms beyond sight, that value existed independent of productivity, that the discarded and overlooked often held the keys to salvation that the celebrated and praised couldn't find. Jack and Caleb stood in comfortable silence, watching the blind horse graze in the fading light, and understood what they were really watching, a living testament to second chances, to the stubborn refusal to define creatures by their limitations, to the truth that real sight had nothing to do with eyes and everything to do with heart. Somewhere in the mountains, fog rolled in again, just weather, just the natural cycle of condensation and temperature, nothing supernatural or meaningful. But in the valley below, a blind horse stood in his pen, and a boy who'd been saved stood at the fence. And both of them knew that when the fog came again and someone got lost again, there was an answer waiting, not in rescue teams with technology, not in trained trackers with years of experience, but in an old chestnut gelding with clouded eyes and a heart that saw clearly through every darkness, ready to climb mountains and find the lost and guide them home, proving again and again that the useless were often the most essential of all. Because sometimes salvation came quietly, on four legs, with eyes that couldn't see but knew exactly where to go and whom to save and how to navigate dangers that would have stopped the sighted in their tracks. Rusty grazed. Caleb watched. And the world, having learned its lesson, was better for the teaching.